This video is my February wrap-up. Welcome to Candlewick Library. I'm Cheryl. I was able to read a lot in February. I did DNF a couple of books, which is probably what made it possible for me to read all of the books that I was hoping to get to in February. First, I want to share the first book that my husband has read. So many of you probably watched the video where I shared the 6 books that I recommended for my husband to read this year. Because there were 6 books, it was kind of an understanding that he would probably take about 2 months on each book, and he wouldn't have to go straight from one book to the next if he finished it in less time than that. The first book he read was Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson, and it did take almost the entire 2 months. I thought that this was going to be a book that he would absolutely have loved. I think that he would have if he had been given this book when he was maybe 12 or 13, but because he kind of knew the story from movies and things, it wasn't as exciting to him because it wasn't all new information. And he did find that it took him a lot longer to read, and he said he wasn't very engaged. So he said he gave it about a 3-star. Definitely less than what I gave it. I loved this book, but my daughter that read it, she kind of gave it about the same. I think she liked it better than he did, but still didn't love it as much as I did. The funny thing is that now, right after he finished this, he started the second book. And I'm not going to tell you what book that is yet, but he is almost done with it, and he's only been reading it for less than a week, and he's almost done with it. So it definitely shows that there is a difference between what books grab a certain person and which ones don't. So I would say this is a win because he read it and he did like it, but wasn't his favorite book. So I will give more information next month on the book he's reading right now. As all of you would know, I took part in the Once Upon a February readathon in February, and so that was focused on reading fairy tale retellings. However, they did say that you were taking part if you only read one fairy tale retelling. I was planning on reading quite a few retellings, but I also used some of the prompts for books that weren't necessarily fairy tale retellings. The way it was set up is that if you read one prompt, you had pixie status. If you read 7 or more, you had princess status. And if you read all 12 prompts, then you were a fairy godmother. I really wanted to get that fairy godmother status, but I did not read one of the books. So I am a princess status with it, but I'm going to share the books that I had used for those prompts first. The first book I picked up was Becoming Hook by Mary Meckham, and I read this for the prompt Pixie Dust, a Magical Creature. I figured that fit perfectly with this book. There were a few times when I was not quite sure about the romance in this book, but overall I liked it. I really liked the characters. I loved Hook, and I liked Tinkerbell. And a couple of the other characters I really like. I really liked Smee, and who would have thought? I really liked the twist that she had on this story. I thought, I've seen Once Upon a Time, and I knew that I loved Captain Hook in that, and that Peter Pan was the villain in that show. And so I wasn't sure how much this would be like that, but it actually was very different. It was a very different storyline and very creative. And I really enjoyed it. I had a lot of fun reading this book, and I think she did a great job of coming up with something that was different than anything I've read before about Peter Pan and Captain Hook and Tinkerbell. I was a little disappointed in the outcome for Peter Pan. So that was my only thing that I didn't love about the book. But yeah, I really enjoyed this book. Next, I read Fox by Nadine Brandeis. I used this for the midnight prompt, which was a hyped book or a book that I was the last to read. And obviously this is not a fairy tale retelling, but it is a retelling of something in history. So that is why I counted this book. This is a retelling of Guy Fawkes. Going in, I thought it was going to be Guy Fawkes that I was following, but it's actually his son. There were a few times reading this where I thought, how in the world did she come up with this idea? The magic was very strange to me, but I thought it was very creative. I thought it was well written. I liked it. I did not like this book as much as Romanoff, but I did really like it, and for a big book, I read it pretty fast. The only other thing that I would say about this, and this may be a slight spoiler, but there is something in this book that I believe is meant to represent maybe God or the spirit of God. I'm trying to figure out how to say this without spoiling it. But I felt like it was and not a good representation of that. That was my only real problem with this book, besides just thinking the magic was a little weird, but I do think it was very creative. The next one I picked up was Ring of Secrets by Rosanna M. White. This I used for Long Locks, a girl with long hair, and I had said that she looked like she had long hair in the picture, and this is a retelling of the Culper Spy Ring. So that is how I twisted that prompt. And this book I love. The main character, Winter, is a part of the Culper Spy Ring, and she is playing a part. She's playing dumb everybody thinks that she's really stupid. When she can be herself, then she is part of the spy ring. And you can see that she is pretending to be completely different than she actually is. And then there's a couple other main characters, a man that is part of the spy ring, and then another man who has come to town looking for the members of the spy ring. There were a few things in here that really surprised me, and I just thought it was so well written, so fun. I loved the characters, I loved the story, and my daughter has read this one since, and she absolutely loved it and immediately asked me for the next book in this series, which I didn't even know existed. Even though they were in the back of the book, I hadn't really paid attention to that, and she immediately asked for those, so I'm gonna have to get those pretty soon. The next book I read was Ponies for a King by Helen Walters. This is not a retelling of anything. I just thought since it looked like it might be medieval, that maybe it would just have a good fill for a month when I was reading some fairy tale retellings. And I read it for the Thumbelina prompt because it's supposed to be the shortest book on your to-be-read shelf. And this is extremely short. It's less than 100 pages. I would say that this is a very simple book, and it was a fine story. It's an interesting concept of a place where they have found artifacts and know that there was some kind of city or dwelling there and don't know anything about it. And this is telling the story of what happened there, and made up a fictional story of what happened there. It only took me about an hour to read it, and I think it would be good for kids. This is from the Good and the Beautiful library. That's a homeschool company, and they used to publish a lot of older books. It seems like now they're starting to publish just books that are written by people in their company. But for a long time, they were republishing books that were older books. Yeah, this says it was originally published in 1963. And so this is their level 5. So this would be considered more of a middle grade children's book. And I think for kids reading it, if they were reading it along with their language arts or something, that a lot of kids would probably enjoy it. But it wasn't anything too special. I didn't feel like it was anything to write home about, but it was a nice little story. Then I read Kingdom's Dawn by Chuck Black. This is the first book in his Kingdom series. And I read this for the prompt Snow Queen, a character on a quest, because I was hoping that he was on a quest based on the cover of this book. And I was right. He did go on kind of a quest. The series is supposed to be an allegory of the whole Bible. This started out really good. I actually really liked it, and I liked the characters. There was one part that I especially loved that actually got me a little teary-eyed. It was between the father of the main character and a young slave girl. And it was so well written that I really felt the emotions of it, and I immediately loved both characters. And I will continue on with this series. My only problem with this book was that I felt like at first I didn't understand what part of the Bible this was supposed to be an allegory of, and then all of a sudden it became very clear. And so I thought, okay, that's the part of the Bible we're going to be at. But then pretty soon it was on to the next part, and then the next part, and the next part. And so it felt like it was one Bible event after another in a very short book. And so I can understand that with only, I think there's 5 books in the series maybe. And so he probably is moving through them very quickly, but it felt like a lot happening in one book. And so I am interested to see where the rest of the series goes. And I think that especially young kids that really love adventure stories like this, or, knights and castles and things, I think that young kids that like that would probably love this book, even if they didn't realize it was allegory of the Bible. Next, I started reading Ferris by Marissa Meyer, or the evil stepmother prompt, which is supposed to be a notorious villain, because this is the backstory of the villain from the Lunar Chronicles. I really liked the Lunar Chronicles books, and so when I saw this in a little free library, I grabbed it thinking that I would probably really enjoy it. I only got a few pages into this, and it was so much more violent than the other books were, that there was a part in just, I think, the first or second page that made me cringe. And I kind of started flipping through a little bit to see what was going to happen. And I found that usually when it's a backstory of a villain, usually you get a little bit of sympathy for them. And it seems like people usually use that as a way to show you who they used to be and how they became who they later would become. But I felt like, just from what I saw, I could be wrong since I haven't read the whole thing, but it seemed like she was already unlikable. So I just decided, if this is going to be this much more violent than the other books and I'm not liking the character, I don't care. So I'm going to get rid of this, and I DNF'd it. And then I picked up The Goose Girl by Shannon Hale. I used this for the prompt Wolf, where an animal is integral to the story, and there is a very important horse in this book, but she's also taking care of geese. So with the name Goose in the title, I felt like that was a good book for the prompt. This is a retelling of The Goose Girl, and this was back when Shannon Hale was one of my auto-buy authors. She could write retellings so well. It had been a long time since I'd read this book, and so I was I've been wanting to reread it for a very long time. And I had actually forgotten how much I love this book. I loved every minute of this reread. I feel like it's excellent writing. I feel like it's an excellent retelling, and I really enjoy the characters. I think this is almost as good as it gets for a retelling of a classic fairy tale. It actually made me sad that Shannon Hill is not putting out these kind of books anymore. Next, I did another reread of Strands of Bronze and Gold by Jane Nickerson, and I did this for the prompt of Bluebeard, a lesser known fairy tale, because this is a retelling of Bluebeard. It's a Bluebeard story told in the South, in Mississippi in 1855. I do feel like this book had some good things about it. I think a lot of people would actually love it, but I didn't like it as much as I did the first time around. It was a lot more violent than I remembered it being, but there also was a lot of kind of inappropriate innuendo. So I would say this is not a terrible book. I think a lot of people would really love it, but it just wasn't my style. I didn't really love the writing in it anymore, but I also just didn't enjoy the story as much. And then I did a reread of my other favorite book by Shannon Hill, Book of a Thousand Days. I read this for the Rose Red prompt with red on the cover. This is a retelling of Maid Maleen. And so in this, when Lady Saren is sent to a tower for 7 years because she won't marry someone that her father is telling her she has to marry, her maid, Dashti, agrees to go with her. And part of this book is them in the tower, and part of it is after they have gotten out. I really enjoyed reading this again. It showcased how much I loved Shannon Hill's writing and her retellings, but I didn't love this one as much as I used to. It didn't hold up in the same way Goose Girl did, but I still think it is a really good retelling. Next, I decided to do a reread of Roseblood by A.G. Howard, and this was for the prompt Musical Voice Incorporates Music or Singing, and this is the retelling of The Phantom of the Opera. And I have talked about this on here before and said that I felt like I needed to go back and reread it before I kept recommending it because I didn't remember. I just remembered liking it, but I thought I remembered a part in it that I didn't like, or that I might not like now, and so I wanted to go back and reread it. I am so glad I did because I'm quickly going to get rid of this. When I first started reading it, I noticed that all of the writing is in pink, and I don't remember that bothering me the first time I read it, but it actually did this time. It wasn't very fun to look at, but I only got a few chapters in before I was just fed up with the writing. I didn't like it. What was really funny is in my memory, I remember loving this, so I thought I'd given it maybe a 4-star or something, and I went on Goodreads to look at my old review of it, and I had actually only given this 2.5 stars the first time I read it. That surprised me so much because I just don't remember not liking it. I usually get rid of books if they are if it's under a 3-star rating for me. So I have no idea why I kept this, but yes, I do not recommend Roseblood anymore. And I didn't finish reading it this time. The last one that I read for this readathon was The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes by Arthur Conan Doyle. And I read this for the Merry Men prompt with a male as the main character. And this is obviously not a retelling of anything, fairy tale or otherwise, but I wanted to read this book in February to continue on with my reading of all of the Sherlock Holmes books. I loved this book. I am definitely turning into a Sherlock Holmes fangirl. There were 12 stories in this. A few of them I had read before in a Classic Starts book, and I kind of wish I hadn't, because I think I would have enjoyed them more had I read them in here for the first time. My two favorite short stories in here were The 5 Orange Pips and The Copper Beeches. And the only problem I had with both of them, they both had unsatisfactory endings, which I think has been my problem with short stories in the past. I like short stories, but they're not usually my favorite because it seems like that sometimes they either don't have enough information or they start out really well, a lot of information, but then end in a rush. And that was kind of how those two both felt, but they were still my two favorite stories. So then besides those two, I decided that for ones that I enjoyed all the way through, probably The Noble Bachelor and The Red-Headed League were probably my favorites. My least favorite was the very first one in the book, Scandal in Bohemia. Not because it wasn't good, but because I felt like its only purpose was to introduce a character that will probably come back later. So I am excited to read more Sherlock Holmes. So the only prompt I did not fulfill was the Fairy Godmother, the gender flip fairy tale. I was going to reread Son of the Deep, but I just didn't have enough time because I had a few other books I wanted to read outside of this readathon, and so this one was left till the very end and I ran out of time, and I decided I just didn't care enough about rereading it right now to have it go into March. For the other challenges in February, for the Read Your Bookshelf challenge, for the mod side it was Puff Sleeves, a book over 400 pages, so I counted Fox for that. And for the Doyle side, it was Elementary, My Dear Watson, a book under 250 pages. So I used Ponies for a King for that. For the Read Around the World-a-thon for February, it was a mode of transportation on the cover. And so I used Becoming Hook for that because there was a pirate ship on the cover. For the Buzzword-a-thon, the phrase was positive words. So I read Hope Between the Pages by Pepper Basham. This is a dual perspective book, with one perspective being in the modern day with a girl that is trying to save the family bookshop. And the other perspective is a young girl who works at Biltmore Estate in their library. I ended up going on a little rabbit trail watching Biltmore tours on YouTube, so that I could picture it better in my head because I've never been there and now I want to go there and see it. But also this book went to the Lake District, which is a place that I love and have been to. This book made me tear up at least 3 times. I absolutely loved it. It's one of my favorite books I've read in a very long time. I loved the characters, especially Oliver. It made me want to go back to the Lake District, and then like I said, it made me want to visit Biltmore just to see the things that they talked about. I felt like it was really beautifully written. Out of all the books I've read by Pepper Basham so far, I think this was her best book. This was definitely my favorite. There was a lot of really good faith content in here as well. It wasn't overdone, it was just really done well. And I did write down a few of my favorite quotes. One of them was when one of the characters ends up in England, and it was very much how I felt. She said, her heart quivered with a sense of familiarity she shouldn't feel, but she'd been here before. How many literary journeys had she embarked upon where England provided the backdrop, and yet even with all the images in her head and online, nothing could rival the real thing. There was another part that was really funny where she said, to be honest, what American female avid reader didn't daydream about an Englishman now and again? And then one of the ones that I really loved was, God allows us the gift of memories to tide us over to eternity. For the G3 Ministries challenge that I'm doing, I was able to use my Sherlock Holmes for the book of short stories. For the prompt, a book by a speaker at a G3 conference, at the G3 conference in 2023, I used Owen Straken's Christianity and Wokeness because he was one of the speakers there. And this was a very interesting book. I really liked it. There were some parts that I underlined that were just great. He sets it up at the beginning of the book of what is wokeness and what is not wokeness, and what is biblical and what is not, and then takes you through the real founding and message of critical race theory. He does it really, really well, I think. I did find that by the end, toward the end of the book, I felt like he was repeating himself a little bit and maybe going on for a little bit too long. The chapters were very, very long. I think this book could have been about half as long, but I did really enjoy it, and I think it is an important book and an important subject. I also did talk about reading Napoleon's Plunder for the Remembering Jenny, and this was about the theft of Veronese's feast. I was very interested in this because I remember seeing that painting in the Louvre, and it just sounded like a really interesting premise of a book. When I didn't realize how big it was going to be, and when I started reading it, I realized that this book is telling the story not only of just the plunder of that particular painting, it's telling all of the history of the Napoleonic War and these artists and the paintings and all those things. So it's very interesting, and I am planning on going back and reading this full book eventually. But at this point, I knew that what I was in the mood for was just to read the part about this particular painting. So once I read the first few chapters and realized how in-depth this book actually is, then I flipped through until I found the parts that I was looking for. And I read the story of this painting, and then I read the story of them taking it and putting it in the Louvre, and then the Germans later taking it and then getting it back to the Louvre. And that was very interesting. I think it is well written, very well researched, but I did not read the whole thing. But what I read I liked, but I did at least read that part. And then the last book for February, I didn't read this whole book in the month of February, but I did finally finish my reread of No Man Knows My History. If you watched any of the videos in the series about this book, you'll know that this just covers the whole entire life of Joseph Smith, who was the founder of the Mormon Church. And it tells the things about his life that most people didn't know. This is not a faithful Mormon book, but it is telling the truth. And so those videos, I go more in depth of all the different things that she talks about in this book. And then I just finished it finally, done with this, done with the series. So I had a really good reading month in February. I really enjoyed most of the reading. Until I read Hope Between the Pages, I thought my favorite book of the month was going to be my reread of The Goose Girl or the Ring of Secrets book with the Culper spy ring. Adventures of Sherlock Holmes would have been right after those. But because of Hope Between the Pages, this ended up being my very favorite book of the month. So I would love to know what you read in February and what your favorite book of February was, or your least favorite.